Have you ever felt rejected by those who should love you the most? Have you ever looked to the side and realized that you were completely alone, as if even God had left you? This is the story of a woman who was despised by her own family and, in the silence of pain, thought that not even heaven could hear her anymore. But what happened next will impact you. When everything falls apart, when hugs disappear, when words hurt more than they heal, loneliness screams louder than any other sound. She knew that feeling well. It was as if every gesture, every look, every silence in the house where he lived was a cruel reminder. You are not welcome here. And the worst thing is when this rejection doesn't come from strangers, but from those who should protect, support, care. Family rejection is one of the deepest pains anyone can carry. And it was exactly this pain that pushed this woman to the limit. She didn't seek luxury. She didn't want recognition. All she wanted was to be seen, to be heard, to be accepted. But each attempt was met with coldness. Every step toward their own was followed by a push, emotional or literal, outward. And when the whole world seems to turn its back, the question comes, has even God forgotten me? Because yes, there comes a time when not even praying makes sense. Words disappear, tears become routine, and faith seems like a thread about to break. How many people live like this right now? How many are feeling that heaven is silent, that no one sees? Your pain, that there is no way out. Maybe you are seeing yourself in this reflection. Maybe, like her, you are at your limit, trying to understand why there is so much contempt, trying to keep faith even without signs. But her story doesn't end here. And that's exactly why you need to keep watching, because God has a very special way of acting when everything seems lost. He doesn't forget. He doesn't reject it. He does not remain silent in the face of sincere outcry. And sometimes he responds in the most unexpected ways. From here, you'll discover how a simple, tearfully murmured prayer began a supernatural turn of events. A transformation that began with rejection, went through despair, but ended in restoration, because the God she thought had abandoned her was actually writing the most beautiful part of her story. Stay with me. What comes next will tug at your heartstrings. But before continuing this story, I need to tell you something very serious. We are living through difficult days, and it is no wonder that so many people are feeling alone, rejected, forgotten, even by God. This is no coincidence. It's a sign. Times are speeding up, and the events that the Bible has already announced are increasingly visible. The world is plunged into chaos, pain, confusion. And do you know what the biggest risk is? It's you going through all this without being spiritually prepared. This story you are hearing is not just about overcoming, it is a warning, a reminder that God still speaks, still transforms, still responds. But we need to be attentive, sensitive, with an open heart. Ignoring this could cost you peace, direction, even salvation. Therefore, I ask you, don't leave this video without leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It's not just for engagement, it's because this content needs to reach those who are lost, those who are living exactly what this woman lived and think there is no more hope. Your click could be the means that God will use to touch another life. And more than that, by subscribing, you guarantee that you will continue receiving messages like this, which strengthen your faith and keep you informed about what is happening and what is yet to come. The next part of this story will show you how, in the midst of abandonment, God prepared an unexpected new beginning. Follow me, because now comes the most beautiful part. This is Julia's story, a simple woman, 32 years old, born and raised in the countryside, in a small town where everyone knows everyone, but where, curiously, she has always felt invisible. Since she was a child, Julia dreamed of a united family, with a house full of laughter and hugs. She was one of those girls who wrote letters to God, asking him not to let her life be like those stories of abandonment she heard around. But as the years went by, he realized that his own story was heading in that direction. Julia grew up in a home full of conflicts. The father was absent, always absent. And the mother, overwhelmed, took out frustrations on her that were not hers. Older brothers who barely talked to her, always treating her as if she were a burden. And yet, she insisted on loving. She tried to please, tried to get closer, but almost everything she did was interpreted in the worst way. The years passed, and that home, which should have been her safe haven, became a silent battlefield. Silent because, despite the hurt, no one said anything. The words, when they came, were sharp. The looks, hard. The affection, non-existent. She grew up believing that she was the problem, that maybe she wasn't worthy of love, that there was something wrong in the way he was, spoke, felt. He carried a dull pain inside him, a kind of constant shame for existing. This shaped his heart. Júlia became silent, moving away from people, becoming increasingly reserved, not by choice, but as a defense mechanism, because every time she tried to open up, she was hurt. As a teenager, he tried going to church with a neighbor, and for a while that sparked a light. But it didn't last long. The family made fun of her, saying she was acting like a saint, which was hypocrisy. She ended up walking away once again, rejected at home, judged for trying to get closer to God. And so, faith was gradually erased. She still believed that God existed, but she began to think that he just existed. She didn't care. Or worse, that perhaps he had more important things to do than worry about her. In her early 20s, Júlia began working to support herself. I had no emotional support, much less financial support. Each achievement was lonely, each challenge faced on your own knees, literally, because even though she felt distant from God, there were nights when she would bend her knees and cry softly. He didn't say anything. I just cried, like someone who knows they are being heard even without speaking. But things got worse. The family's indifference turned to coldness. Coldness turned to contempt. And then came the last straw, an unfair argument, an unfounded accusation, and Júlia was kicked out of the house. With a backpack on his back and a broken heart, he left aimlessly, without understanding how this could be happening. How could someone who always tried to do everything right end up like that? She had nowhere to go. He slept at a co-worker's house for a few days, but he knew it was temporary. I tried to maintain the routine, work, pretend that everything was fine. But inside, she was destroyed. It was as if my entire life had been built on sand and everything had collapsed in seconds. One Friday night, after work, Júlia decided not to go back to her colleague's house. I felt like I was no longer welcome there. He walked for hours, aimlessly. He ended up stopping in front of a small church, now closed. He sat down on the front step, leaned his back against the wooden door, and collapsed. Tears fell like rain. There were no words, there were no forces, just pain, and it was. There, on that cold ground, under the dim light of a streetlight, that she looked up and whispered, "God, if you really see me, show me. Show me, because I can't go on anymore." That simple, desperate prayer carried the weight of years of rejection. It was more than a request. It was a cry from the soul. Júlia didn't want miracles. I didn't want riches. I just wanted to know I wasn't invisible. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever reached the point where you think that even God has forgotten you? Have you ever wondered if your prayers really go up to heaven or get stuck on the ceiling of your room? If so, leave it in the comments. I've felt this way. Let's create some real space here in the comments, because maybe your story is more like hers than you realize. And while Júlia thought she was living the end, the sky began to write a new beginning. God was moving behind the scenes, stitching together the details of an answer that would come completely unexpectedly. And believe me, what happened after that night was so surprising, so full of grace, that not even she could have imagined. You need to see with your own eyes what God has done, because when He decides to act, no rejection, no harsh words, no pain from the past can stop the miracle. And what was about to happen in Júlia's life wasn't just an answer. It was a complete transformation. Stay with me, because what comes now is the part that changes everything. Since adolescence, Júlia carried a label that she never chose. She was different, and it wasn't the kind of different that arouses admiration or respect. It was the kind that generates crossed looks, awkward silences and whispers when you leave the room. Among her brothers, she was the quietest, the most sensitive, the one who cried a little, the one who cared too much. But instead of welcome, he received contempt. While her brothers were praised for small achievements, she was forgotten. When I tried to participate in family conversations, I was interrupted, ignored, or worse, ridiculed. They began to treat her as if she were a burden. No matter how hard he tried to help, to please, to be present, his actions were always misinterpreted. If he remained silent, they would say he was arrogant. If she spoke, they said she was dramatic. If it helped, they said it wanted to attract attention. And if he made a mistake, even in minor things, it was as if he had committed a crime. The demands were harsh, cruel, relentless. Júlia didn't understand why it was like that. There was no clear explanation. Sometimes I felt like I was born into the wrong family. Other times she believed that the problem lay within herself. But what hurt the most was knowing that all of this came from precisely those who should love her unconditionally. The contempt that came from outside would be easier to bear, but coming from within, it was like a knife that went in slowly, day after day, and was never taken out. Little by little, she began to believe that she was not worthy of affection, that maybe love was a thing for others, but not for her. And this belief took root in his heart, like a lie that, repeated so many times, begins to seem like the truth. And this is where many people identify, because how often does rejection come from those who most promise to be by our side? How often does emotional abandonment start at home? How many times have you tried to be accepted by people who simply weren't willing to love you as you are? Leave it here in the comments. I've felt this. Maybe you, like Júlia, grew up carrying a pain that no one sees. Maybe you smiled for family photos, but inside you were broken. And if that pain is still there, if there are still open wounds, you are not alone. This video is for you too. Júlia tried for many years to adapt to family standards. She tried to shape herself, fit in, hide her emotions so as not to be criticized. She tried to be what they wanted her to be, but in return, she received even more coldness. Time passed and emotional wounds accumulated. Moments that should have been joyful became empty. Forgotten birthday parties, missing words of support, non-existent gestures of affection. She had nowhere to run. School was a temporary escape, work a momentary relief. But at the end of the day, she returned to the same toxic environment, the same looks, the same accusations, the same silence that screamed rejection. And it was in this context that she began to question herself. Does God see this? Does he care? Because no matter how much she tried to keep her faith, it was difficult to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the reality of a home without affection. She heard about the Father's love, but the only father she knew barely remembered his existence. She heard about brothers in Christ, but blood brothers were the ones who hurt her the most. This confusion between divine love and human rejection began to distort his view of God. And this is where many also stumble. Because when we are hurt by those who should represent protection and care for us, we end up transferring these wounds to our relationship with God. With Júlia, it was no different. At a young age, she began to move away from the church. The environment that once gave him a little peace began to seem like a place of hypocrisy. She began to feel out of place there too, as if there was no place for her anywhere. Faith has become fragile, almost invisible. She still believed, but without strength, without motivation. It was as if she only carried a remnant of faith, a thread that still tied her to hope, but was about to break. The pain of family rejection did not stop with cold gestures or harsh words. It invaded thoughts, shaped self-esteem, contaminated relationships outside the home. Júlia began to distrust everyone. She had difficulty opening up, trusting, believing that someone could really like her without hidden interests. In romantic relationships, she always gave herself too much, afraid of being left again. And almost always, it was. The pattern of abandonment repeated itself, as if life was determined to confirm what her family had always implied, that she was not enough. And all of this was piling up, like a fine rain that seems harmless, but over time, it floods. Júlia's soul was flooded with pain, guilt, insecurity. And even when she tried to start over, even when it seemed like things were going to get better, something would happen and pull her back. A comment, an unexpected visit from family, a bad dream. Anything was enough to reignite the pain. Until one day, at the height of this internal turmoil, what she never imagined happened. A conflict with her older sister, an unfair accusation, a moment of emotional explosion. Júlia tried to explain, tried to defend herself, but her voice was never valuable in that house. She was called ungrateful, a problem, a burden. And then came the sentence, "If you're not happy here, the door is open." She hesitated for a second, but deep down, I knew I had already left a long time ago. I just needed to physically leave. He grabbed some clothes and documents and left, not knowing if I would return, not knowing where to go. But with a certainty in her chest, she could no longer bear to live in a place where she was treated like a mistake. And this is where everything starts to change. Because when all human doors close, when all earthly voices reject you, it is the perfect moment for God's voice to be heard. And even if Júlia didn't know it at that moment, even if her heart was in pieces, the sky was already moving. God was already preparing meetings, opening paths, touching hearts. Because He never abandons a child, never. And what happens next will show this in detail. It will prove that the God who appears to be silent is actually devising a complete restoration plan. A plan that begins with rejection but ends with belonging. And Júlia was about to discover this in the most unexpected way possible. That night, when she left the house with a backpack on her back and her heart crushed inside, Júlia had no idea that she was about to live the darkest days of her life. There was no certain destination, there was no plan, there was no one waiting for her outside. Just a bitter, heavy silence, as if the entire world had stopped for a moment just to witness his pain. The streets seemed too cold, the cars passed too quickly, and time seemed to move in slow motion. That feeling of not belonging anywhere was now literal. She no longer had a home. That house, no matter how difficult it was still the only place she could call her own. And now, not even that was left. In the first few days, Júlia tried to maintain some dignity. He slept at a colleague's house, but soon realized that that shelter was temporary, almost out of charity. Every word, every gesture from her friend carried the weight of someone doing her a favor. And Júlia, who already felt like a nuisance in her own family, began to feel like a burden outside of it too. It was then that he decided to leave there. I didn't want to be tolerated. I wanted to be welcomed. I wanted, more than ever, to be truly loved. But the more he sought this love, the more he came across closed doors. The financial situation also worsened. With his emotions shaken, his work performance fell. Absences, delays, anxiety attacks that prevented her from carrying out simple tasks. The boss, without knowing the details, just saw an unstable employee, and before long the dismissal came. No home, no family, and now no job. Júlia, who always tried to keep the faith, found herself completely broken. She felt like she had been left out by everyone, and perhaps even by God. On one of the coldest mornings that winter, hungry and without a safe place to sleep, she took shelter in a square. He wrapped himself in an old coat, lay down on a concrete bench and, for the first time in his life, asked himself if it was really worth continuing. What hurt wasn't just the cold of the night or the pain in my stomach. It was emptiness, the absence of meaning, the feeling that there was no reason. She remembered the promises she had heard in church years ago, the preachings about a God who cares, who sees, who welcomes the tired and oppressed. But there, alone under the dark sky, she wondered if all that was really true. Did God really see someone like her? Could it be that with so many children to care for, would he have time to look at a rejected, discarded, forgotten woman? "God, do you see me?" she whispered, not even having the strength to cry. His words were lost in the freezing night air, and the only sound that came back was the rustle of dry leaves dancing in the wind. It was as if the sky was silent, as if God had turned his face away. And it is at this point that the pain reaches a deep, almost unbearable level, because there is a type of suffering that comes from lack of resources, injustice, loss. But there is another, more cruel, more silent, that comes from the absence of hope, when even faith begins to fail, when the last thread that binds us to life seems to come undone. That's when many think about giving up, Júlia thought, not in taking your own life, but in stopping fighting, in accepting that maybe that was your reality, that there was no rescue, there was no answer, there was no miracle, that perhaps she had been chosen to suffer while others were chosen to win. And it's shocking to think how so many people are experiencing this same dilemma now, people who walk the streets with forced smiles, but inside they are screaming for help. People who sleep in warm beds, but feel the same cold in their souls that Júlia felt on that park bench. If you have ever experienced something similar, if you have reached the point of questioning whether God really sees you, comment below. I also hit rock bottom. You can't imagine how your comment can connect others who think they are alone. This space is safe. Here, your pain is heard. In the days that followed, Júlia tried to ask for help. He sought shelter in assistance centers, knocked on doors, looked for churches, but everything seemed stuck. People were too busy, institutions were crowded, hearts hardened. One day, as he passed a broken mirror in an alley, he looked at himself and almost didn't recognize himself. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, his hair disheveled. But what scared her most wasn't his appearance. It was realizing that inside it was even worse. The sparkle in her eyes that she once had was gone. She started talking to herself in a low voice. I walked the streets and said things like, maybe I'm not cut out for a normal life. Maybe I'm just here to exist, nothing more. Heavy words filled with pain, but which echoed naturally within her. He was no longer scared by these thoughts. Pain was already part of his daily life. I no longer asked for miracles, just for some peace. I just wanted a night's sleep without fear, a plate of food without humiliation, a look that said, I care. And it's curious how, even without strength, even without apparent faith, something inside her continued to pulse. Something very small, almost invisible, but still alive. Maybe it was that last thread of faith that she had carried since she was a little girl. Maybe it was the distant memory of a verse read years ago. Maybe it was just the voice of God whispering softly when everything seems silent. The morning after her worst night, Júlia woke up with her body aching, her mind confused, and her heart heavy. But one thing made her get up, a strange desire to walk. I didn't know where or why, just started walking. The steps were slow, drawn out, but they had a destination that she didn't yet know. And this seemingly meaningless walk was the beginning of something supernatural. Something was about to happen, something she would never have imagined. Because God, even when he seems distant, is always close by. He sees every tear, every sigh, every thought we hide even from ourselves. And when we decide to continue walking, even without strength, even without direction, he acts. What Júlia found along the way will surprise you. What seemed like just another day of suffering became the beginning of a turning point. An unexpected meeting, an unlikely conversation, and an invitation that would change her story completely. But this you will understand better now in the next moment of this story that is just beginning to reveal the invisible but powerful action of a God who never abandons his own. And then came that morning. It was still early. The sun had barely touched the horizon, and the early morning cold seemed to want to stay in that corner of the city for longer. Júlia walked aimlessly, her body exhausted and her spirit even more so. Each step was an effort, as if carrying an invisible weight, a burden of rejection, of shame, of loneliness. It was as if the soul was hurt inside, full of scars that no one could see, but that throbbed without stopping. She didn't know where she was going, but there was something that moved her. Maybe it was the tiredness of running away. Maybe it was the last spark of faith left inside her. A weak, trembling faith, small, like an almost extinguished ember, but still lit. And it was following this silent intuition that she arrived at a street she had never been to before. A simple, almost deserted street where time seemed to move slower. And it was there, at the end of the sidewalk, that his eyes found a church. Small, with a simple facade, but there was something about that place that made her stop. The doors were closed, of course. It was too early for any services or meetings, but even so, Júlia approached. He climbed the 2 steps to the entrance, sat there, leaned his back against the wooden door, and just stayed. The entire world seemed to have slowed down. The sounds of the city gradually disappeared, as if God was creating a space just for her at that moment. And then, in the deepest silence of his soul, something happened. The tears came first, not those of despair, but those that arise when the soul begins to surrender. She cried like a tired child, not because of the immediate pain, but because of the sum of all the pain accumulated over the years. Each tear that fell carried a memory, a cruel word, a hug that was missed, an "I love you" that never came. He cried like someone emptying their heart, trying to find some space to breathe. And after the crying came the clamor. Not a clamor with screams, not elaborate words. It was a whispered prayer, almost inaudible, but it echoed like thunder in the heavens. God, if you really see me, show me. I can't take it anymore. These words were spoken with the sincerity of someone who has already lost everything, of someone who no longer has a reputation to maintain, of someone who no longer cares what others think. It was the request of a surrendered soul, of someone who has come to the end of themselves and now, finally, opens themselves to the supernatural action of God. At that moment, Júlia did not expect an immediate response. I didn't expect to see an angel, hear an audible voice, or receive a sign. She just wanted to know she wasn't alone, that somehow heaven was still listening. And perhaps you, who are watching this video, have also said a similar prayer. Maybe you too have reached the end of the line, and even without strength, managed to whisper, God, I can't take it anymore. If this has ever happened to you, write it here in the comments. I have already cried out in silence, because sometimes the biggest screams are not heard with the ears, but with the heart. And there, in that closed door, on that cold floor, Júlia had the truest moment of her life with God. It was there that she put aside all the masks, all the attempts to appear strong, all the defenses she had built for years. There was no longer an image to protect, no dreams to disguise. There was just her, and a God that she didn't yet fully know, but that somehow she knew was still around. She didn't see anything extraordinary at that moment. No visible miracles happened. The church door remained closed. The sky did not open. But something inside her began to change. It was as if, for the first time, someone had truly listened to her pain. Not as someone who listens out of politeness, but as someone who feels together, like someone holding your hand without judging, as if to say, I know, I've been here the whole time. This silent outcry marked the beginning of a turning point. It was not the end of the struggle, nor the immediate solution to all their problems, but it was the seed planted in fertile soil. It was the moment when God heard not only the words, but Julia's soul. And there is something powerful about that kind of surrender. When we stop trying to control everything, when we stop fighting with our own strength and just surrender, God enters. And it was from there, in that seemingly insignificant place, that God began to move the pieces of the puzzle. A series of events was about to be unleashed. Invisible connections were about to form. People would be placed in their path. Words would be released. And old promises that she no longer remembered would be fulfilled. But it all started there, in that silent surrender. Because this is how God works. He reveals himself in the most unlikely moments. He approaches when everything seems lost. He responds when we finally recognize that we can't do it alone. Julia couldn't imagine it. But at that very moment, as she cried against the door of a closed church, someone was getting ready to cross her path. Someone that God had already touched. Someone who, without knowing it, would be the answer to that prayer. And that's exactly what we're going to see next. How God uses seemingly random encounters to perform extraordinary miracles. How he transforms the silent cry of a broken soul into the soundtrack of complete restoration. And what happened right after this outcry will show you that, even in silence, God is always working. You will see with your own eyes that help comes, that the answer arrives, and that no sincere prayer is lost in the air. So stay here with me, because the next part will show how, after completely surrendering, Julia had her first response. A simple answer but full of meaning, something that could go unnoticed by many, but which for those who are attentive to the movement of God reveals the beginning of a new time. And maybe what you'll hear next is exactly what your heart needs right now. On that freezing morning, when the day began to rise lazily over the still half-asleep city, Julia continued sitting there, leaning against the church door, as if she were part of the structure of that place. His eyes were swollen, his face marked by a bad night's sleep and the weight of a lifetime of trying to be strong, trying to belong. There was still no one around, and the silence was only broken by the sounds of hurried footsteps of those passing by without noticing their presence. It was as if she had become invisible for good. But it was precisely at that moment, this one, which seemed so ordinary, that something extraordinary began to happen. As she discreetly wiped her face with her coat sleeve, trying to regain control of her emotions, a figure appeared on the other side of the street. She was an elderly woman with a calm walk, dressed simply, carrying a market bag and a small blanket in her hands. She came slowly, but her gaze was not lost in distractions. From the moment he turned the corner, he seemed to know exactly where he was going, straight toward that church, straight toward Julia. Julia, used to not being seen, didn't even expect that lady to notice her. But that's not what happened. When the woman approached, he stopped right in front of her, looked into her eyes, and with a softness that carried an invisible authority asked, "Are you cold, daughter?" That seemingly simple question touched something deep inside Julia. It had been so long since anyone called her daughter, with affection, with tenderness, with a tone of care. She just nodded, unable to respond with words. The woman then crouched down, spread the blanket, and placed it over Julia's shoulders with a gesture that wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was as if in that act God said, "I am here, I have heard your cry." After that, the lady sat next to her, like someone who had time, like someone who wanted to listen. And in silence they stayed there for a few minutes, sharing a moment that not even angels would dare interrupt. The air felt different. The surrounding climate had changed. It was as if the sky itself was witnessing that scene, without asking invasive questions, without trying to control the conversation. The woman just said, "I come here every Saturday morning to pray before the service starts. But today I felt something different, like I had to leave early. And when I turned the corner, I knew it was because of you." Julia, now with hot tears running down her face, realized that this woman was not just anyone. She was the answer. She was a compliment. It was a sign that God still spoke, still cared, still sent people when everyone else walked away. The lady then extended her hand and asked in a firm and loving voice, "Do you want to spend the night at home, daughter? There's no need to be afraid. There's a comfortable sofa, hot soup, and if you want, tomorrow we can come to worship together." Júlia hesitated. She had already learned to distrust kindness. But there was something about that woman that disarmed his defenses, a different presence, a sparkle in his eyes, a way of speaking that recalled the stories of faith he had heard as a child. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she could trust it. He accepted the invitation, and when I got up from that cold floor, it felt like I was also getting up from years of accumulated pain. There was still no solution to all the problems, but there was a new beginning. The walk to the lady's house was silent, but full of meaning. Júlia felt as if with each step she was leaving behind part of the weight she was carrying. The house was simple, but there was a peaceful, welcoming atmosphere. It was as if God had prepared this place especially for her. There, he sat at the table with the lady, who introduced herself as Donna Esther, and for the first time in a long time, he ate a hot meal prepared with love, not with pity, not with obligation, but with affection. Donna Esther prayed before serving, thanking God for another daughter that he had brought to her home. Júlia didn't know what to answer. He just cried, but now they were tears of relief, tears of someone who, after so long, was starting to believe again. That night, as he lay on the couch with the blanket he received in the morning, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Security. It wasn't her house. It wasn't her family. But there was something there that she always sought, the presence of God. She felt as if she were being wrapped in invisible arms, as if someone were silently saying, "You are loved, you are seen, you have a place." And it is impossible to describe exactly what happens to a soul when it comes back to believing that it has value. But anyone who has been through this understands. The next morning, she went to worship with Donna Esther, still shy, still suspicious, still with a recovering heart, but something inside her was different. During the message, the pastor read a verse that seemed to have been chosen just for her. It was as if God had just used that man to remind her that her story wasn't over yet, that there was hope, that that prayer whispered before the church had been heard, and that all of heaven had moved to answer. And you? Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever experienced that moment when you realized that God was surrounding you all the time, even when you thought he was silent? Have you ever felt like a person appeared in your life at the right time, like a divine sign? Write here in the comments, "I have found God in the unexpected," because these stories are not fiction. They are real. They're happening every day. Maybe they're happening to you right now. And while Júlia took her first steps into that new environment, not yet knowing what the future held, the sky continued to work. Because the restoration that God was beginning there would not just be emotional. He was preparing something bigger, something that would go beyond momentary comfort. Júlia had no idea, but what was to come would involve healing, reconciliation, and a purpose she could never imagine living. She was about to find out that she wasn't rejected by chance. She was separated, and what God does with those the world despises transforms not only lives, but entire destinies. And you will see this with your own eyes from now on. Living with Donna Esther was, little by little, restructuring something inside Júlia that she didn't even know still existed. Hope. The welcome of that simple woman, but full of the Holy Spirit, was not just temporary help. It was the beginning of a journey of restoration that would transform not only what Júlia felt inside, but also who she would become from now on. And the most impressive thing is that nothing was forced. Donna Esther never pressured. She just lived her faith so authentically, so lightly and powerfully at the same time, that in itself was healing. Little by little, Júlia began to participate in the meetings of the small prayer group that met at Donna Esther's house on Wednesday nights. At first, she just listened. She sat in a corner, quietly, trying not to attract attention. But all it took was for the group to start singing. All it took for a prayer to be raised, and something inside her reacted. It was as if that environment broke the invisible chains that still held his heart. God's presence was palpable. There was no luxury, no grand structures, but there was truth, there was faith, there was anointing. And that was exactly what began to free Júlia from the emotional prison in which she had lived for so many years. One night, after intense prayer on his behalf, something different happened. Júlia, for the first time in a long time, felt a peace so deep she couldn't explain it. It was not a passing emotion. It was as if someone had lifted a weight from inside her. A weight she didn't even know she carried with such intensity. And there, in that moment, she felt that she was being healed, not just from the visible wounds, but from those that were hidden in the deepest layers of the soul. Wounds of abandonment, rejection, humiliation that marked his identity for years. It was as if God was rewriting with his own hands every part of his story. After that night, Júlia started looking for more. He began to read the Bible with thirst. Every verse seemed to have been written for her. The stories of women restored by Jesus, the Psalms of David, the letters of Paul, it all made sense now. The Word ceased to be a distant text and became living food for his spirit. And the deeper she dove, the more she realized she was never alone. That even on the darkest nights, God was there working in silence. And God didn't stop there. The restoration went beyond the emotional and spiritual. As the months went by, Júlia began to help Donna Esther with church tasks. Little by little, she gained confidence, until one day she was invited to share her testimony at a women's meeting. He was scared, trembling, thinking that no one would want to hear his story. But when she opened her mouth and told everything she had experienced, from the rejection to the outcry in front of the church, the room was filled with tears, as if every person in that room was being healed along with her. After that, they began to call her to give small studies, then to pray for other women in similar situations. And so, what was pain became ministry. What was despair became a tool. Júlia understood that her story was not a reason for shame, but for testimony. Because God doesn't waste pain, he turns every tear into seed. She began visiting shelters and institutions for women in vulnerable situations, bringing words of faith, consolation, and transformation. And what was most impressive was that people connected with her immediately. Maybe because he wasn't speaking from a theory, but from a place of truth, of someone who had been rejected, trampled on, forgotten, but who was healed, restored, and lifted up by a God who never stopped seeing her. And then, years after that first meeting with Donna Esther, something that she no longer expected began to happen. Her family reappeared. First it was a call from her sister, then an unexpected visit from his brother. At first, Júlia was defensive. I was afraid of reliving the pain, of opening again the wounds that had taken so long to heal. But God had done something so deep in her heart that she now had the spiritual maturity to handle it with grace. The reconciliation was not immediate. It wasn't like the movies. There was discomfort, there were tears, there were belated requests for forgiveness. But there was also a move of God that brought healing to both sides. Júlia, who had been the rejected one, was now the restoration bridge. The prayer made in silence, leaning against the door of that church, was being answered completely. God didn't just welcome her, he restored her. This not only healed his heart, but also those around him. And maybe you're listening to this and wondering, could something like this happen to me too? The answer is yes. Because the God who transformed Júlia's pain into purpose is the same one who can transform her story too. If you have experienced something similar or are waiting for your own reconciliation, write here in the comments, I believe in God's restoration. Your comment could be the spark of faith someone needs today. Júlia was no longer that broken, invisible, worthless woman. She was now a daughter, beloved, empowered, spirit-filled daughter, used by God to reach other lives. And the most incredible thing, is that she never sought it. It all happened when she finally stopped fighting alone and gave herself up, when he decided he couldn't handle it anymore and let God do what only he can do. And as she continued serving, witnessing, discipling, something even deeper was being prepared. Because God's transformation does not stop at the first blessing. He doesn't just fix what's broken, he builds something new. And what was to come in Júlia's life was even more surprising, more than she could ask, imagine, or dream. A turnaround that would clearly show that the good work that God begins, he also finishes. But this, you will see with me in the next part of this story, that continues to reveal the supernatural action of a God who transforms rejection into mission, pain into ministry, and crying into dance. And looking now at Júlia's journey from silent rejection to full restoration, it is impossible not to be moved by the way God writes the stories of those who surrender to him. What seemed to be the end was, in fact, the beginning of a new identity. Júlia, the woman despised by her own family, ignored, accused, thrown out of the house, became a reference of faith, of overcoming, of transformation through grace. It all started with a whispered prayer, with a silent cry made by a tired soul, and God answered. Not with thunder or spectacles, but with details, with divinely orchestrated encounters, with hands outstretched at the right moment, with voices that said exactly what she needed to hear. The restoration that God made in her life was not just for her to live in peace. It was so that she could carry this peace wherever she went, so that, through her story, other women, and men too, would discover that rejection doesn't define anyone. Human abandonment is never the end of the line when there is a God who remains faithful even when everyone else leaves. Júlia became the answer to other people's prayers. She who once asked for help is now an instrument of healing. The one who felt invisible is now seen, recognized, and respected, not because she sought fame or approval, but because she was transformed from the inside out. And maybe now you're there on the other side of the screen, carrying the same pain. Perhaps you have experienced profound rejections, some that even today you cannot put into words. Maybe you are feeling forgotten by everyone, even God. But I need to tell you this with all the conviction in my heart. When the world turns its back on you, God opens his arms to you. He never abandons his own, never. He may be silent now, but he's not distant. He may appear hidden, but he is working where your eyes cannot see. And just like what happened with Júlia, her response may be being prepared at this very moment. And you know what? Your pain is not too small for God. Your story is not too messy for him to put in order. God specializes in new beginnings. He is a master at rebuilding what was broken. He does not waste suffering. Your every tear is seen, every prayer made. In the dark is heard, and when you least expect it, he will act. In a unique way, supernatural, unquestionable. If this message spoke to you, if at any point in your life you felt the same pain that Júlia felt, of not being loved, of being discarded, of having no value, write here in the comments, God, I welcome your open arms, because there is something powerful about declaring this. There is a healing that begins the moment we admit we need him. And often, your confession here can be the trigger for someone else to find strength too. This is not just a video, it's a meeting point, a place of consolation, faith, and a fresh start. What Júlia experienced was real, and what you can live with will be too. God remains the same. He still heals, still restores, still transforms. And he didn't finish. There is more, much more. And in the next part, you will see how God's faithfulness goes beyond what we imagine, how he prepares paths where there is no road, how he surprises even the most hardened hearts. Stay with me, because what is to come will speak deeply to your heart. You are not alone. You are loved. You are seen. And above all, you are chosen by a God who makes no mistakes. He transforms the early morning cries into a testimony that reaches multitudes. And that's what we'll continue to discover together. If this story touched your heart, if at any point you saw yourself in Julia's pain, or if you felt hope reborn within you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel right now. Here you will find many other real stories that prove every day that God still transforms, still responds, and still performs miracles. And if you've made it this far, to the end of this video, I know that God has spoken to you in some way. So I want to invite you to leave a special comment below. Write like this: God saw me and reached me. This simple act can be confirmation of something that heaven is already doing in your life. And it can also strengthen those who are reading the comments in search of a word of faith. Let's spread this message together. Like, comment, subscribe, and never forget, you never went unnoticed in the eyes of God. He was always with you. And the most incredible thing is that everything that happened to Júlia was just the beginning, because what God was preparing after that surpassed anything she had imagined. An unexpected door opened, and the transformation that began in the heart expanded to areas she thought were lost. In the next video, you will see the exact moment when her past stopped being a scar and became a living purpose. Something supernatural happened, and it was there that she discovered that God doesn't just restore, He also sends, raises, empowers, and surprises. You will see how her fresh start turned into a mission, and how lives began to be achieved from what one day seemed like just pain. Prepare your heart, because what comes next will renew your faith even more.